This is the Podcast Digest. This is episode 72. We are approaching the end of 2015. And for this episode, I decided to do something a little different. In fact, very different, as a matter of fact, because this is something I've not done in about a year. It was December 30th of 2014 was the very last time I put out into the world a completely solo episode. And that's what this is going to be. It's the holidays, the holiday season for most of you listening. If you celebrate Christmas or Hanukkah or whatever it is that you celebrate, this time of year, everybody's got a lot going on, obviously. It's very busy. People are coming and going. People are going out of town. People have relatives or friends coming in town. And newsflash, booking is hard during the holidays. Finding a guest and finding some of the wonderful shows to highlight for you guys over the last week or two has been a little tough. And so for the first time all year, I've hit a little snag, and I had a thought. I was like, well, do I either take a week off, which, mind you, I've never done so far. That day is coming, I'm sure. I'm sure there's a day coming in the future where I'm going to be taking a week off because it's just it can't go forever, right, in terms of consecutive weeks. Or do I come back and put together a solo episode for you guys? So after some thoughts and consideration on what could I do a solo episode about, I looked at the calendar and looked at the timing, and I said, you know what I could do? I could do a year in review, a look back, or better yet, even come up with some superlatives or awards on this first full year of the Podcast Digest. So that's what I've got for you guys here in episode 72, which is actually going to be the last episode of the year. So at the time that this hits the airwaves, we'll only have a few days left in 2015. I can't believe 2016 is coming so quickly. And 2015 has been a great year for me personally and for the show. And the fact that you guys are listening to us, the fact that anyone is tuning in right now to a show title that basically just refers to not having a guest is really humbling to me. And I can't tell you how much I appreciate all of you taking the time to listen, the feedback that you provided me on social media, emails, comments on the blog when each episode comes out. It's really heartwarming. I've heard some wonderful things from so many people that they've enjoyed the show, that they've got something out of it, that they've found other great things and are then starting to enjoy those shows. And that's really what I set out to do back in September of 2014, was to sort of share what I found out there in the podcasting world, and I hope that it's something that you would like as well. And it appears to be doing pretty well. So I wanted to talk just a little bit about the show, about what 2015 as a first full year has meant. There's been so many highlights for me, so many milestones that have occurred as the years wore on. So many great episodes, guests, co-hosts. I've just had a blast doing this, and I really hope that you guys have had a blast listening to it. I don't plan on stopping anytime soon, although, one might say, are you ever going to run out of shows to recommend? And the answer is no, I don't think that I will. I keep cycling through my subscription list, adding new things all the time, and so far haven't necessarily hit a roadblock. So let's start our look back. Let's look back over the year with the Podcast Digest. My very first episode of this year, ironically, was the very first episode where I truly interviewed somebody. Now, real hardcore fans of the show will know that back in episode 14, I did what I called a special. Still the only time I've used that word in any of my episode titles, but I had my brother, Chris Lizette, in town, and him and I basically did a quick conversation in person. It was more or less a hardware check than anything else. So besides that, our first real interview with other podcast folks was David and Andy from A Cool Story Show. That was episode 19, released the first episode of this year. And you guys will know David Meyer, one of those two guests on that, has been a frequent recurring guest. In fact, as I mentioned just a couple of shows ago, back on episode 70, I've now had Dave on the show 3 times in 2015. And Dave Meyer is one of my favorite people in all of podcasting, and he's a great guest and a great conversationalist, and he was there as my first interview, and he joined me for a recommendations episode, what I call it, I bring in my co-host, if you will, to recommend great shows that he had listened to. And at a time, he was doing a lot of written reviews of shows that he'd found. And so I wanted to kind of partner up the written review with what I was doing here on the Podcast Digest. And we did that in March. That was episode 28. I called it Original Format because I was going back to my strict show recommendations format. And that went really well, and that was very well received. That's the first time I sort of put that out there where I had a quote-unquote co-host. So David Meyer was my first 3-time guest, my first co-host on a recommendations episode, and also my first interview. So that's how I kicked off 2015, which was a ton of fun. And then from there, it just kept going. And early on, I was very fortunate to be joined by some excellent guests. If you are a late arrival to the Podcast Digest and you're sort of just jumping on this bandwagon now and starting to say, wow, there's been a lot of great stuff lately, I really encourage you to go back to some of these early conversations, especially early on in 2015. There were a lot of wonderful people that joined the show very early on, and I'm really indebted to many of these people because they certainly took a chance at a time when I really had no sway, no influence, and one might argue I don't really have any of that now. But I spoke with Sean from No Totally, Dana from How Is This Movie, and S. Anthony following up Dave's show, and there was so much fun to be had on all of those conversations and to get to know those folks. One of the milestone episodes for me was episode 23. That was one I entitled Technology and Podcasting with Tim Robertson. He's a host of a show called Tech Fan, and I've been listening to Tech Fan and Tim Robertson as a podcast for many, many years, and it was a real thrill for me to be able to sit down and talk with Tim Robertson. Still one of my favorite conversations and one of the most well-performing episodes. So if you want to kind of hear me be a little bit humbled by my guest to be talking to that person, episode 23, released on February 1st of this year, was a good one for that. Several great episodes followed that. Then there was one that sort of will come up in just a little bit as well. Episode 26 was a conversation with Matt and John from a now retired show called That'll Play. Really sad that show ended up being retired as Matt and John looked to other things. It was a really great entertainment and culture show, if you will, talking to a lot of independent artists and creative types, and one that you could still get to their back catalog and hear some of the great conversations they had. And then the next one on March 1st was sort of, I guess you could call my big break, if you will. Phoebe Judge from Criminal, one of the banner shows on Radiotopia nowadays. They'd recently joined Radiotopia at the time of our recording. And Phoebe Judge was just amazing to talk to. As I mentioned, in those early days, there wasn't really much of a discussion around the Podcast Digest. I was really kind of struggling and clawing and begging anyone I could to come and join me and talk about their show, of those that I'd obviously, had become fans of. And I was a huge fan of Criminal, and still am. Criminal is one of the best shows out there. And the fact that Phoebe Judge took the time to join me, and I remember that one took about 6 weeks to put together that conversation, and I slotted in on her calendar, and I only had about a 45-minute window to talk to her. And I did the best I could, and it was one of my first real kind of like big interviews, at least the way from my perspective. And I think it went well. I've heard some good things about that conversation. That was episode 27, if you missed that one as well. And then from there, we went on and did so many other great things. It was right around this time. It was actually on March 15th that I want to go back, and I mentioned Matt from Matt and John of That'll Play. Matt Candela was one half of that show, and he is also an amazing graphic designer. And on a whim, I asked Matt if he would help me out with redesigning, or really designing, a logo for the Podcast Digest. And what you see today on the album artwork, on iTunes show artwork, all over the website, all over the Twitter and Facebook pages is what Matt did back in March. And I have been super thrilled and super proud of that logo ever since. I've put it on vinyl wall stickers, my business cards. I've had it done on a fracture. I've pretty much put it everywhere. Had a couple different rounds of shirts. And right now on the website, the podcastdigest.info, if you look in the upper left-hand corner, you'll see TPD store, links over to a Redbubble page. And Matt's excellent work is now adorned on all kinds of different products that is available through Redbubble. And that was a big moment for me. And to have a professional actually work up logo and artwork for the show itself. So huge thank you to Matt Candela. And I believe his website is mattcandela.com if you want to see some of the other great work he's done. Then I mentioned those shirt sales, and we had a couple different rounds of those. They did super well, and I was really proud to see some of the pictures coming in on social media with other podcasters or just listeners showing off wearing the shirt, which is really humbling to think that people are walking around with my show's logo that has my name on it out there. And for anyone who's listening to this and maybe considering starting a podcast or something someday, boy, that feeling, I don't know how you recreate that or how you can get that same feeling from other lines of work. I mean, imagine musicians or artists, those type of things. But for those with a little less creative talent like myself, this was one way to share in that type of feeling, and it was excellent for sure. Throughout the year with the show, we've done any number of technological updates as well, in addition to the logo, trying to make this as professional sounding in operation. I did some upgrades to hardware. I moved off, believe it or not, the first 20 or 30 episodes were recorded and edited on an 11-inch MacBook Air. And that was fun. Not a great screen or a great size of a screen to be able to handle full-fledged Skype recording and editing and production process, but I made it work. So in wanting to upgrade the show, that is when I added some of the intro and outro music and used Fiverr to get the voiceover with the English lady you hear on the outro nowadays. Went on eBay and won an auction on a very nice 2011 Mac Mini that had some great specs to be able to handle a lot of the production that I wanted to do, and got a couple of external monitors. And so now I have a dual monitor setup, which is actually very similar to my day job. So I'm very comfortable working in two monitors. And so I can sort of slide things around, have websites and links and stuff open while I'm recording and editing, and works excellently. And only just a couple of months back, you guys heard me talk about it. If you've been a listener for a few months now, upgraded the microphone as well. I am now on the Shure Beta 87A as recommended by Marco Arment. An excellent microphone, not the cheapest thing in the whole wide world, but definitely not the most expensive either. And I've been totally thrilled with the microphone and the production process, and everything has really come together, and I'm very happy about where sort of the technical setup for the show is. Other things that happened in 2015 that I was pretty darn proud of. The show charted a couple of different times on the iTunes chart. At one point, I believe the show got up to number 10 in the podcasting subcategory, which is under technology in the category listing in iTunes. In the podcast directory. Now, iTunes has since reshuffled the deck. They've gotten rid of a lot of the subcategories now. When they did that, I decided to change my category affiliation anyway. I'm not sure why I'd put myself in technology when I first set up the show, but now I've listed, I believe it's society and culture now. I don't know if that was the best move. I've actually never charted in the new setup for iTunes for podcasting now, but I just feel better about it being more about the right place, because I think the society and culture component is a lot more about what the Podcast Digest is about, at least some of the shows and people I'm talking to, because I'm exploring shows and I'm recommending shows to you guys, but I'm really talking to and getting to know the people behind the shows. And so I definitely broke well beyond the constraints of what I think the technology category was originally intended for. So I did change the categories there. But either way, being able to take those screenshots and share with my family and friends, if you will, that the show had actually hit a chart was kind of a big deal. It's not the end all be all. It doesn't mean my show is a monstrous success or what have you. It just means there was a couple of really great episodes over the summer there that I was super proud of, and apparently a lot of you liked listening to. So thank you very much for the reviews on iTunes. I really need to be better about thanking all you guys for the reviews on the iTunes. I think I'm over 30 now. I would always love more. So if anybody has looked back and gotten any enjoyment out of the show in 2015, please feel free to add to that number, especially if that's of the 5-star nature. But it's been a lot of fun looking at the show grow in that way. And so, as I mentioned from the beginning, I wanted to wrap up this year, not just with the solo show here and kind of a look back and rehashing, but I wanted to give you guys something new to chew on, and especially those people who have newly arrived here listening to the show, and highlight some things in the past year that if you want to go back and fill up something, if you're traveling or you're on break right now or you've burned through your playlist, here's a couple of old episodes that I'd like to highlight with the Podcast Digest in the form of a year-end awards program. So I'm going to do an annual awards show. First one, even though it's my second end of year, what I did last year is end of year. Some people were asking me, are you going to do that again? And I did a top 10 episodes last year. And what that was built on was of all the shows that I'd recommended. Inside of each of those shows, what were my 10 favorite episodes of the shows I'd previously recommended? And that was a painstaking process, and it was an inexact art. It was definitely not science. It was just, as everything is with the Podcast Digest, my own personal opinion. And I attempted to integrate show clips in with my top 10 countdown of my favorite episodes. I think it worked pretty well. That was kind of legitimately on the fly with an iPad hooked up to a second channel of a mixer and pre-queued shows and hopping back and forth. And but looking back at a full year now, all the different shows that I've recommended the Podcast Digest, I'm approaching now 100 shows that I've reviewed or recommended here on the show. It was pretty daunting a concept to think, oh, could I go back through all the episodes all these shows have released to come up with a top 10 list? The answer is realistically no. So I decided to change my approach, and I'm doing an award show. So what does that mean? So I've come up with a couple of different categories, just fun categories, and I've picked who I think or what I think the winner of those categories would be. Again, this wasn't a poll. There's very little factual information or data to lean upon, with the exception of really one category. And it's just sort of my feeling and my impressions and my perspective on looking back at the year for the Podcast Digest. So let's talk about our first category in my year in review award show here on the Podcast Digest. And that was, what was the most popular episode of the year? This is the one that I just mentioned that does have some data behind it. I'm not going to necessarily get into specifics of numbers of downloads, and folks who are not podcasters listening to that, you probably notice most podcasters don't. So I will keep with the common trend and just talk about what was the episode that was heard the most throughout the year. And that was episode 32 that was released on March 29th. And that was with my guest, Michael Fisher from Pocket Now, a technology-based show, a podcast that is also very regimented with their weekly releases. They always have a show out every week. One of the ones I kind of said, well, I'll miss a week when Pocket Now does. That may be a tough standard to live up to, but Michael Fisher has a large following on Twitter, as does Pocket Now, and so when they shared the interview that I did with Michael, which was just a blast. Michael Fisher's a super cool guy, and I had a ton of fun talking to him. When they shared that on their social channels, it was inevitable that the show would reach a lot of ears, and it did, and I was very appreciative, and very appreciative of all the great feedback I received from that. That episode still does well, and I think most of what Michael and I talked about, even though that was March, still holds true in the sense of the world of the Pocket Now Weekly podcast. And I'm still listening to that show, and if you want to know why, go back to episode 32. Michael Fisher from Pocket Now was the title. So that was my most popular category. How about this one? Somebody might once ask me, what guest, of all the guests that you've talked to, because I've been very fortunate, as I mentioned, to have talked to a lot of great guests, was there one particular guest that you were the most nervous in having on the show? And yeah, there certainly was. There's a first and a second place on this one, if you will. Easily, episode 45, released on June 21st, when I spoke with Brian Koppelman. Brian Koppelman is an excellent interviewer on his show, The Moment, previously of Grantland, now of Slate, and he does phenomenal work as an interviewer in his prep and his depth of knowledge of his guest and their life stories and their accomplishments and their backstory. And he really gets to the meat of a lot of issues that you don't see very often in a lot of interview shows. And I do try to take a page out of his book as much as possible. Although, frankly, I don't know that I will ever be able to delve in and dig deep the way he does. Those who aren't familiar with Brian Koppelman outside the podcast world, he also happens to be the guy that wrote Rounders in Ocean's 13. He's a screenwriter, and he's also right now finishing up. He's in production, I believe, or almost post-production of a show coming to Showtime in 2016 called Billions, starring Paul Giamatti and others. And to know that this is what this guy does every day and has accomplished, and the fact that I had a chance to sit down and talk to him was pretty darn nerve-wracking. So that would be my first choice for the most nervous prior to an episode. That said, after I talked with Brian, I felt great. I thought the conversation went well, and it was also, he was a pure joy to talk to. He put me right at ease, and none of that really came to the forefront. He kind of just treated me like another guy, and we had a great conversation. My runner-up in the most nervous to talk to category also did a super great job of putting me at ease right off the bat. So my very close runner-up was when I spoke with Jason Snell in episode 35. That was on April 19th. Jason Snell is a huge guy in the Apple world, used to write for Macworld, and had all kinds of sit-down conversations with some of the bigwigs in technology and Apple, and a guy whose work I've been a fan of for a long, long, long time, and he's huge in podcasting, whether it be Relay FM or the incomparable, his own podcast network. And talking with this guy was just a blast. I way went past our allotted time, and it was so much fun to talk with Jason Snell, but I was certainly a good bit nervous prior to that conversation. So how about the best moment, if you will, of all these hours sitting behind this microphone? What was the episode that contained the best moment for me in putting out the podcast digest so far in 2015? And this was really my easiest category and my easiest answer. Again, fans of the show probably know exactly what I'm going to say. Episode 44, released on June 14th, with my very good pals, Neil and Annalise, with Dark Angels and Pretty Freaks, were my guests. And to surprise them, and I did this legitimately as a surprise, I did not tell them, I had convinced my wife Sheila to join us on that episode, and I brought her in right after I hit record. And so Neil and Annalise didn't know it was coming, and their reaction was awesome. Sheila did a great job in that episode, and she was wildly nervous. And that was the one and only time I've convinced my wife to join me on a podcast, and it was a blast. I had fun doing it. I think she did as well, and it was maybe the best moment, if you will, in all of the recording here on the Podcast Digest so far. So if you want to hear that, my wife would love to have your feedback. She's not even on Twitter, so you can just tell me and I'll be happy to share it with her. Episode 44 with Dark Angels and Pretty Freaks. All right, so let's get into some of the bigger categories now, shall we? Some of the really, really big ones that will probably cause some conversation. Sorry, I had to take a quick drink there. I forgot about how much talking just by yourself is draining on the vocal cords. I haven't done a solo episode in so long. Usually I'm just spitting out a question and waiting for an excellent guest to give me the answer, and my job's super easy. Now it's all me. Big props of those of you out here who run solo shows and do this regularly. I can't believe I started out doing it this way. So, categories. How about this one? I've come up with this one. Episode of the year. All right. So of all of my podcast episodes released in 2015, so that's between episode, let's see here. What are we going to say? Just so I can mark it straight. I believe it's episode 19 to this last week. Yes, episode 19 was released on January 4th, and episode 71 released last week. Of all those episodes, what do I consider to be the absolute best episode of the Podcast Digest, in my own personal opinion? Gosh, this is so hard to come up with, but this is what I've come up with. The best episode, in my opinion, was episode 33, which was Alex Goldman from Reply All. That was released on April 5th of this year. So why do I pick episode 33 after all of these? It's kind of like picking your favorite kid, right? Parents, they say, oh, you can never pick your favorite kid. This one, the reason I picked this up was this was when Reply All was still fairly new. As was here at the Podcast Digest, we were still fairly new as well. But Alex agreed to talk to me. It was supposed to be both Alex and PJ, but due to scheduling, I only got a chance to talk to Alex. And I don't know that I've had a conversation that you can actually hear that started out early, where we were kind of sort of getting to know each other in the conversation. And by the end, I thought we were having such a wonderful conversation. And in the last couple of minutes of that episode, Alex actually starts to interview me and turns the conversation on me in terms of my fanhood of podcasts. And at the end, I felt like I'd really produced something in that conversation that listeners of both the Podcast Digest and Reply All would really find valuable. That people who like those shows will really love this conversation. At least that's what I felt at the end. And again, I've heard so many good things about it, and this was a really tough decision for me on what I consider to be the best episode of the year for the Podcast Digest. I did make arguments in my mind for several other episodes released this year, but for now, that's what I'm settling with. Episode 33 with Alex Goldman from Reply All. I've got 3 more categories to run through here, guys. 3 more categories. So, co-host of the year. This is super hard to do. So I had 5 or 6 people join me throughout the course of the year that came on, and we talked about their project and what they're doing. We usually talked about a discussion topic, usually something current eventy, if you will, in the podcasting world, as well as recommended 2 shows each on, things that we were currently listening to and we wanted to tell people about. Each and every one of these went so well, and I got so much positive feedback about folks being able to kind of hear a conversation about what was going on or what was hot in podcasts at that time. And when I decided to name a co-host of the year, the only reason I did decide to do this, well, every single one of them were excellent, and I am really appreciative of those folks who took the time to join me and did some research and prepared their notes and brought them over. The one that I would say my co-host of the year was Devin Taylor from episode 50 from the website The Timbre. My conversation with Devin was so much fun. Devin and I had actually talked about a week and a half prior to the recording, just to kind of get to know each other, talk a little bit about what I do at my show, what she does at the Timbre, and just see, where could we possibly take a conversation about this. And ultimately, what was interesting about that was we talked a lot about what she's doing with the website, and it became not so much a co-hosting show as more a conversation about her and the website. But ultimately, we ended up throwing in recommendations at the end, and it sort of felt like, since we were both coming from the same place in terms of huge podcast fans and telling our listeners or readers about great things, it turned into a recommendations episode. And during that pre-conversation, we talked for about an hour and a half, and it wasn't even recorded. And then we came back like a week and a half later and did it again. Devin and the work that they're doing over there at the Timbre are some of the best reading that you can do about podcasting in general, especially if you're a fan of the narrative or story-driven genres. The Timbre is for you. And obviously, I'm a fan of those genres. I've talked about them and recommended them and interviewed their hosts and creators on many of the episodes here on the Podcast Digest. So, co-host of the year will go to Devin Taylor from the Timbre on episode 50 that came out on July 26th. So, I've got two final categories, and these are the biggies, if you will. I'm doing what I'm calling the podcast of the year for the indies and a podcast of the year for overall, which includes both indies and commercialized podcasts, if you will. So how do I, first of all, I need to draw this line, right? Because this has been a long conversation on the Podcast Digest through many of my interviews and conversations about what's indie and what's not. For the purposes of this, I'm taking the indie podcaster as, people who are not necessarily monetized or monetized very small monetization, and that they are more conversational than they are, narrative or story-driven or what have you. Not that those couldn't be mixed up. They're obviously narrative and story-driven podcasts that are definitely done by independent producers as well. But for the purposes of this, that's kind of how I tried to put them in their own little buckets. And so with that as a backdrop, let's cover first the podcast of the year in the indie category. My podcast of the year for the indies is going to the show featured on episode 42, released on June 7th, and that is Couple Things. Couple Things podcast is one of my favorite listens each and every week. They do a great job. Two couples in their late 20s that have just been best friends for a good long while. They have great topical conversations. They say they bring 4 topics and they discuss them barroom style. They say that on their intros, and it's an appropriate summary of what it is that they do. These are great folks. They put out a great show. It's a wonderful listen, and just hearing these guys take apart these different topics that they tackle each week has just been a blast. It is one of my favorite shows, and here's hoping that a couple things continues to grow, and these 4 stay at the top of their podcasting game, because I've been a fan for a long time. I bought their shirt. I wear their shirt regularly. I'm a huge fan. So my indie podcast of the year goes to Couple Things. All right. My final category for this year in review episode of my 2015 Podcast Awards is my podcast of the year overall. So this could be any podcast that, obviously all of these categories are shows that I've featured previously on the Podcast Digest. This has to be previously featured, and one that could be indie. It could be kind of commercialized or professional, if you will. Just of all the shows I've featured at the end of this year-long journey or adventure that I've been having with the Podcast Digest, as I find and talk to all these show creators and recommend all these great shows, what is the one that has stood out to me as I would consider to be the podcast of the year overall from everything I've featured on? Believe it or not, this was actually pretty easy for me to come up to. You would think it would be difficult or it would be hard. And because it was pretty easy when I first started to think about this category, I knew that I wanted to select this one for this category. And that's going back to episode 48, released on July 12th, Sword and Scale. Sword and Scale is an absolute mind-blowing podcast. It is rare that I talk about a show or talk to a creator about a show that this thing can literally mess with your head, blow your mind, and will leave you stunned and in awe of what you've just heard. But it's not for shock value. It's not for scare value. It is this analysis and look at that creator Mike Boudet does at these horrible true stories, and his archival reach back to old audio and clips and stories and the research he does. You look at the show notes, it is exhaustive. And when I talked with Mike back in July, he talked about, in excess of 40 hours of production goes into each episode of Sword and Scale. And that is so completely clear. He just finished up a very successful, funding round, if you will, listener support, and he's coming back for season 3. Should be hitting here shortly in 2016, and I, for one, cannot wait for what's coming next from Sword and Scale. Guys, if you are a fan of true crime at all, or if you just want to hear something that is unlike anything you've heard before, you need to be listening to Sword and Scale. As for my money, for my time, I would put this above just about even shows that are not I've not yet featured on the Podcast Digest. I mean, I'm a fan of a lot of shows that I've not featured because I've either haven't been able to connect to the hosts or arrange an interview, and there's hopefully some more good stuff coming out very soon on that front. But even of all of the ones of my current, I have over 100 shows in my podcast app right now. Sword and Scale is right at the top. And I hope that means something when, I heap that much praise on it. It's deservedly so for what Mike Boudet has put out in the product or the show that is Sword and Scale. So check it out if you haven't listened to my conversation with him. It was episode 48, released in July of this year. This year that has come to an end, that has been wrapped up, that we have finally approached the finish line on. The next episode that comes out, episode 73, will be in the first week of January. And we will be back for a new year. I've got plenty of emails out and tentative schedules discussed with more guests, more hosts of some of the favorite shows that I hope you love, that I hope you've loved finding through your listenership here with the Podcast Digest. Guys, it has been a blast in 2015. I've really had so much fun, and I look forward to what's next. And I can't thank all of you enough for your support. And I look forward to seeing you guys all on the other side of the calendar flip. And until then, thanks again so much. My name is Dan Lizette with the Podcast Digest.
Thank you for listening to the Podcast Digest. You can follow the show on Twitter at PodDigest. Like the show on Facebook at facebook.com/The Podcast Digest. Email the show feedback at thepodcastdigest@gmail.com. And you can find all the previous episodes and exclusive blog entries at the show's website, thepodcastdigest.info.